good that I'm going last because I get the benefit of working with all of you. I work with policymakers, I work with hospitals and clinicians, and I do work both in the ambulatory space, so working in very small physician practices, all the way up to very large hospitals and health systems. And I think you know, one thing that stands out to me as I'm listening to the other comments is that we're talking about privacy and we're talking about security, and they're two different things, and a lot of times we actually commingle those terms, and I think it's important to just sort of get an understanding, a baseline, that privacy is all about, you know, what we're trying to protect, and the security is how we do it. So from the clinician's point of view, information needs to flow for all kinds of, you know, treatment purposes, and billing office, it needs to flow for business purposes. And I would argue that nobody that is setting policy wants to impede any workflows that actually need to occur in order to achieve business purposes. But when you start tying in the security regs and you start looking at the technology and looking at how you have to actually implement certain things to actually make that happen, that's where we come up with problems, because sometimes, you know, you can put the best security controls in place, but then it breaks something. It breaks a process, it breaks a workflow. And so a lot of what I end up doing with clients is advising them on how to find that sort of middle ground, how to find the reasonableness approach to balancing what they're trying to achieve from a regulatory and compliance perspective and what they need to be able to do to show that they're truly maintaining a secure environment. And you know, we secure data and information in these systems not only to protect privacy, but also to make sure it's reliable and to make sure it's accurate. So security has three real components. It has the privacy piece, but the accuracy and the integrity of that data is just as important for patient safety issues and all kinds of other reasons. So we can't forget that piece too. So if you've got a virus that infects your network and all of a sudden it corrupts your data, that's, to me, way worse than finding out, you know, that Dick Cheney was at GW again last week. So, you know, those are the kinds of concerns that security professionals have when they're trying to, quote, lock down the system. I think, you know, it's really achieving that balance. The other, you know, points that I wanted to touch on, you know, somehow, is that we do need to consider the culture, the environment that we have in this country. We're talking about, you know, protecting information that is truly sensitive. There are negative consequences to data breaches, and so we, you know, have to think about what patients do want, what they expect from us. Just like when you go and do your online banking, you know, what do you expect the bank to be doing to protect your financial data? Well, we as citizens and people who all use the healthcare system, I'm sure, have different ideas about what we expect the information and how we expect that to be protected within the healthcare setting. And obviously, you know, if I'm seeing a physician, I want that doctor to know everything he or she needs to know about me, but I may not want, you know, nurses who are not unrelated, who are not treating me, to have access, especially if, you know, there's just no reason for them to have access. I don't want necessarily other administrative staff if they don't have a reason to access. And I think, again, that comes into the reasonableness approach, and that's sort of the tack that I take is, you know, let's look at what's reasonable. If it's, and I think that's what policymakers have taken when they talk about things like the minimum necessary rule, which is, you know, getting the minimum amount of information necessary in order to do your job. So not limiting it so you can't do your job, but making sure that it's the appropriate level of information. And I think it's easy when there are common problems or things that are not sensitive in nature, and people are willing to give up their, quote, privacy because it doesn't really impact them. But if you have situations where you've got psychiatric illness, or you've got abuse going on, or you know, there are obvious conditions that would require a little bit more sensitivity. But we, Sumit and I see this operationally. I mean, we have issues with employees. I mean, we have, you have to have policies. We all know what we put in place for like VIPs. Well, what about employees? Do I want necessarily everybody in my office knowing that I was in the emergency room for some bizarre situation? Not necessarily. And so, we come up with, policies and things all the time. And actually on the way up here, I was actually on a call with a current client who literally I've probably spent 20 or more hours having a conversation just around how they're going to implement certain break the glass technology, sequestering records, making parts of the note confidential versus the entire patient confidential. And even when the technology application can do something and it has that functionality built in, you still have to create the policy internally and operationally and how you're going to apply that universally so that it can actually work with your workflow. So it is really challenging. I think it's not a simple issue. I deal with these issues every single week with clients, so it keeps us on our toes.